We left off last time with the matter of covenant after the flood story. And so it's like a new beginning after what happened in Eden. New first parents, Noah and Mrs. Noah. She doesn't somehow merit having a name in the story. Notice about the changing human role. I told you should watch how God makes himself known through the course of the story, and together with that, how humans relate to God. Notice that Noah has to build his own ark. Adam and Eve didn't make their own clothes. God makes their first clothes for them. Noah makes it himself. Noah has to act himself. Still, Yahweh personally closes the ark after the flood, or just before the flood. And God personally smells the sacrifice at the end. So in some ways, you're still seeing a God who is deeply involved. And on the other hand, it's not quite the same as in the Garden of Eden, where God walks in the garden with humans. So just note those and watch, because you may have guessed already there's going to be a trend with regard to this. Notice there's another etiology here, another story of origins, and it's why there's a rainbow. You can imagine if you don't know the science of the rainbow, the first time in your life you look up there and you go, whoa! And especially if you get a really good one, especially if you get a double, you go, what is that? How did that get there? And if you're a religious person and don't know about reflection and refraction and so on, which I never knew if it was refraction or reflection involved there, then that's why I'm in Bible, not physics, you see. Then you go, well, what is that? And you'd need an explanation. Here's an ancient text. Tear down this house, build a ship, give up possessions, seek life, forswear worldly goods and keep the soul alive. Aboard the ship take thou the seed of all living things. The ship that thou shalt build, her dimensions shall be to measure. Equal shall be her width and her length. Like the Apsu, the sea, thou shalt seal her. I understood, and I said, behold, my Lord, what thou hast ordered, I will be honored to carry out. Whatever I had, I laid it upon her. Whatever I had of silver, I laid it upon her. Whatever I had of gold, I laid it upon her. Whatever I had of all the living beings, I laid it upon her. All my family and kin I made go aboard the ship. The beasts of the field, the wild creatures of the field, all the craftsmen I made go aboard. For one day the south storm blew, gathering speed as it blew, submerging the mountains, overtaking the people like a battle. No one can see his fellow, nor can the people be recognized from heaven. 6 days and 6 nights blows the flood wind as the south storm sweeps the land. When the 7th day arrived, the flood-carrying south storm subsided in the battle which it had fought like an army. The sea grew quiet. The tempest was still. The flood ceased. I looked at the weather. Stillness had set in, and all of mankind had returned to clay. The landscape was as level as a flat roof. I opened a hatch, and light fell upon my face. Bowing low, I sat and wept, tears running down my face. I looked about for coastlines in the expanse of the sea. In each of the 14 regions there emerged a region. On Mount Nitzir the ship came to a halt. Mount Nitzir held the ship fast, allowing no motion. When the 7th day arrived, I sent forth and set free a dove. The dove went forth but came back. Since no resting place for it was visible, she turned round. Then I set forth and set free a swallow. The swallow went forth but came back. Since no resting place for it was visible, she turned round. Then I sent forth and set free a raven. The raven went forth, and seeing that the waters had diminished, he eats, circles, caws, and turns not around. Then I let out to all the 4 winds and offered a sacrifice. Now, that sounds strangely familiar, doesn't it? Now, that's the Gilgamesh epic that I mentioned last time, Tablet 11, which is a good 1,000 years older than the story we're reading in the Bible. And this was a well-known book in the ancient Near East, and it was one of the versions of the flood story that you see has some pretty obvious parallels with the Bible. Now, from that, I'm not trying to claim that the Bible took it or stole it or who's first or who's second in its origins. I mean, we know who's first. The Gilgamesh epic is first. But the point relative to the text is that the Bible tells it in its way, and the Gilgamesh tells it in its. Most notably, I was deliberately leaving out some lines. So wherever there was a reference to multiple gods, I just didn't read it, so it would sound more clearly like what you read in the Bible. But there's some very striking differences. Now, the next story of these early sections of the Bible is the story that's called, usually in English, the Tower of Babel. It's the Tower of Babylon, and it's the standard word for Babylon. And I don't know why everywhere else in the Bible it's translated Babylon, except in Genesis 11 in this one story. It's called the Tower of Babel. So as long as you know that this is a story about the city of Babylon. In that story, it's the first attempt of human rebellion as a community. So there's one thing where the first humans don't do the one commandment they're given in the garden, or when Cain kills Abel, which are individual acts. But now humans are a community, and they do this thing that is unclear. They want to build a tower and a city, and the top of the tower will be in the sky, and they say, so we'll make a name for ourselves, but it doesn't explain what that means. And God says, well, now if they do this, nothing will be held back from them. And so God says, let us go down. And again, you have a plural. And again, we're not going to explain it until lecture 24. That God says, let us go down and let us confuse their languages there. So after that, people all start speaking different languages. They don't understand each other, so they go off in all different directions and form different areas. And so this story is the etiology of language, why humans speak different languages, and it's the etiology of why there's different countries all around the world instead of us all just living in one place and talking the same. It's also the etiology of the name Babel, where it happens to be a pun in the Hebrew. You all got it, didn't you? It's Bavel, which is Hebrew for Babylon. And it says because God confused their languages there, and the word for to confuse is balal. So you see it's a flip of the name Babel. So they called it Babel because he made them babble there, which would be a cute parallel pun in English, except the verb to babble in English actually comes from this story. So it kind of ruins the pun, doesn't it? As I was driving this morning, I heard some disc jockey on the radio saying, it's written in stone, so don't take it for granted. And I thought, that's as good as that one I gave you in the last lecture. Like, how would you translate that? If this disc jockey were, in France, how it wouldn't work. It is written in Pierre, so don't take it for granted. It just doesn't work, in my English French. Now, this Hebrew etiology / etymology for the name Babylon is wrong. The people who lived there themselves understood the name Bab in Sumerian means gate, and Alani is the gods. So they understood the name of their city, Babylon, to mean the gate of the gods. And indeed, there really was a giant temple tower in Babylon. We call them ziggurats. You get a lot of really brilliant art in this course. That's a ziggurat, because gods are supposed to dwell on the mountains and all, and in that region it's flat. They didn't have mountains, so they made mountains. But now they've given up ziggurats for good. And how would you do that in French? You guys didn't even like it in English. What would be the point of that? But this particular one in Babylon has a name. It's called Etemenanki, which you don't have to memorize, but just trust me that is Sumerian for the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. And that's really interesting then, in light of the biblical story, which certainly seems to be an allusion to that temple tower. So that ends the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which are called the primeval history. Don't confuse that with the word evil. It's the primeval history, like evolution. You know, you have to pronounce these words correctly. That is to say, the first 11 chapters of the Bible are not the story of ancient Israel. They're not the story of Moses or Abraham or anything of the famous specifics of the Bible. It is a story about all of humankind. And that's a striking fact in itself, that ancient Israel saw it that way. The Israelite authors of the Bible. If someone would say to you, write a history of the United States, very few of you would say, well, okay, in the beginning there was the Big Bang. And then it burst out, and then about 12 billion years later, along came these people sailing from a place called Europe to a place called North America now, and they named it, Vespucci land after Amerigo Vespucci. And you wouldn't tell the story that way, not only because it isn't as funny as I'd like it to be, but also because no one would think of going back to the beginning of time when asked to do that. But the biblical authors do that. If you would say to them, tell the story of Israel, they'd say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that's striking, that you had to get that. And so now when we're going to turn and narrow to a specific person again, you have to understand all that background behind it. And one of the classic works about the Bible of modern literary criticism was a brilliant work called Mimesis, by Erich Auerbach. It's one of the great brilliant works of comparative literature, and in each chapter he's taking different great works from history and showing the different ways that they develop a story and how they would tell it. And chapter 1 is called Odysseus' Scar, and it's a comparison of how Homer would tell a story in Greek literature and the way the biblical authors tell stories in their literature. So from the outset, there's the point, of course, that the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer are in poetry, and the stories we're reading in prose. So we've already noted that that's a dramatic difference. But there's more than that. He said in Homeric literature, the whole story is in the foreground. Everything is here in your face. And as an example, he tells the story of Odysseus' Scar. If any of you have read the Odyssey already, then you might remember this extraordinary scene in it, that Odysseus, has been away for all these years fighting the Trojan War, and then he was away for more years on this long journey back, and now all his guys have gotten killed, and he's finally coming home to his wife Penelope, who's been fighting off every guy in town who's been wanting to make her his woman, and thus he would replace Odysseus as the king. And Odysseus comes back, and nobody recognizes him but the dog. And even his wife notes that he really looks a lot like her husband, but he's dressed as just a passing guy, and she's not sure. And then he's a guest from outside, and he sits down, and they order this old woman to wash his feet, which, is something done for visitors in the Bible as well. So this old woman is a woman who had taken care of Odysseus when he was a boy. And she's washing his feet, and they accidentally knock over the water bowl, and it splashes water on his leg, and she sees this big, deep scar on his leg. And she looks at the scar and recognizes it. Flashback. He's a young man. He was going out on his first adventure as a man, and he goes to see his grandfather, who's going to make a man of him. And the grandfather takes him on a wild boar hunt. And he's leading the wild boar hunt, and he's got a spear in his hand. And he comes into this thicket, and suddenly there's nobody but him and the wild boar. And it attacks him with its tusks, and he pierces its heart and kills it. But at first it slashes his leg and makes this terrible wound that he almost dies of which he almost dies. And then he's healed, and he goes back. Modern times, the woman is looking at his leg, and she goes, "Ah, then you are my Lord Odysseus." Now, what did the author just do there? He used a flashback to give you information that you needed in order to understand that scar. He hadn't told it way back at the beginning of the story. He gave it to you when you needed it. Thus, Auerbach argued that in Homeric literature, what you need is always in front of you. It's all foreground. It's in your face. Now think of what we're going to do. You read the story of Abraham, and you have to know that 10 generations before Abraham, there was Noah and this flood and all. And before that, you have to know that there was this creation of the earth. And when it begins with God telling Abraham, move from the place where you're living, which is Ur, to this other land I'm going to send you, which turns out in the end to be Canaan, which becomes Israel, you need to know that there are different nations and different languages for him to move from which, that. So what Auerbach said about the Bible is that it's rich in background. Each story becomes the background of the thing that comes next. So it's really rich. And a lot of us miss that because most people learn their Bible in one story at a time. You grow up and you either go to Sunday school and your Sunday school teacher picks a different story to read each time, or you go to a church or synagogue and the minister or the rabbi preaches a sermon on the particular reading of that day, or you study the Bible with commentary, so you read a verse of the Bible and you look at the bottom of the page and there's comments on it. Few people step back and read the whole flow of the story, and so they miss this tremendous point that this was a whole new way to do literature in the world, where it's rich in background. And today, almost any novel you read is done that way. So appreciate what we're doing then. In this course, we are starting at Genesis 1:1, and we're reading through to Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, the last books that tell the story, and we're watching the flow of the story first. When we're done doing that, we will go back and address more questions of how historical things were, who wrote it and when, and all those sorts of things. So for now, just the story, though I won't be able to resist certain historical things because I can't, but I'll do my best. So it's 10 generations after Noah, and the world is lousy again. So when it was 10 generations after Adam and the world was going bad, God just wipes out the whole creation, but then, he's a merciful as well as a just God, and that throws him off every time. And so he goes, okay, one more chance. So he starts out with one really good guy, figuring, okay, now we'll get a good world. You think that's what he's figuring, and since God does not confide in us in the story, and 10 generations, things are bad again. But this time, instead of wiping everybody else out, which God had promised he would never do again, he chooses one guy who's really good, and he's going to make a second covenant with that man, this Abraham, so that his descendants, in the end, will have some connection where they do good. And so in God's first words to Abraham, he gives the reason why he's doing this. And that's a big deal because for most of the Bible, God is not pictured as giving reasons for why he does anything. It's not, you shall not murder because it's not nice and you'll hurt them and their family, how they make it. That's not what they do. What's the fun of being God if you have to explain yourself all the time? So when God says do it, it's the words that every parent dreams of getting to say sometimes, because I said so. And so in this case, it's very striking where God does give a reason. In his first words to Abraham, he says, I'm going to make this covenant with you. All these things are going to happen. You're going to move to this land because then your generations will become a blessing for all the nations of the earth. So it had to establish that there are different nations, and now the purpose of this is through one way or another, which is not defined, this man's descendants are supposed to be some kind of good for the whole world. Abraham's son, with whom the covenant will be renewed, will be his son Isaac. Isaac's son, with whom the covenant will be renewed, will be Jacob. And as you read through Genesis, if you notice, in God's first words to Abraham, in God's first words to Isaac, and again in God's first words to Jacob, he repeats these words, that the purpose of this is there'll be a blessing to all the families of the earth or all the nations of the earth. That means it's important. Yet most people read it and never notice it. So, how does it begin? God says to Abraham, leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house. Now, in these early stages, as with the Garden of Eden, I want to look at the text very carefully, look at the individual words, and get a sense of how the literature works. We can't do that for the whole Bible, or we'll never get out of the first half of Genesis an entire semester. So once we all see that you can read the Bible that way, where you can focus in on every word and there's riches and beautiful development and all that, then we won't point every one of them out, but you have to go, oh yeah, but they're there, right? So God says to Abraham, leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house. Okay, so here's his land. And then the city that's his birthplace, which is the city of Ur. And then here's his father's house. It had a door and a chimney and smoke. Picket fence. No dog in the yard. The dogs hadn't been domesticated yet. And early readers of the Bible, even 2,000 years ago, noticed that this is backwards, that he says, leave your land, your birthplace, your father's house. If you've left your land, you have left your birthplace and your father's house. It's backwards. And you go, okay, what lesson should we take away then from this wording? Was it that the author really wasn't very good at geography? Or was it that the author was making a point that was something other than geography? Like what if it was psychological, not geographic? It's one thing to tell somebody to leave their country, to leave their land. It's another to say your birthplace, the very city where you grew up. It's another to say leave your family, leave your father's house. So what's happening is it's becoming harder and harder. And you see that this goes on a lot in the Bible. It becomes a theme in the Abraham stories that Abraham is always being tested. So when we come to Genesis 22, the famous story of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice, commanded or asked, we'll see in the text, to sacrifice his son Isaac, God says to him, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. And, that makes it harder. It's the same thing that happened in this story. And in fact, there's terrific midrash on that particular one. I said I wouldn't do a lot of midrash, but on this one, they imagined Abraham sort of having this in-between-the-lines dialogue with God. So God says, take your son. And he says, I have two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. God says, your only son. He says, yeah, Isaac is the only son of Sarah, and Ishmael is the only son of Hagar. And he says, whom you love. No, I love both of them. Isaac. So now that's not in the text, but the text being richly drawn opens up the door for that. And indeed, at the end of the sacrifice of Isaac's story, when Abraham was willing but then doesn't have to give the sacrifice of his son, God says, now because you did this and you were willing to sacrifice your son, your only son, then he's rewarded. So the measure of how hard he made it at the beginning is the measure of the reward at the end. That's good writing. He says to make this move from the city of Ur, which really was a city in Mesopotamia, and to go to this new land. And it's for these two reasons. One, he says, your descendants will become a nation. And second, they will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Notice how this figures in the matter of God's appearances to humans that I've been advising you to track. At the beginning of this story, it says, and Yahweh appeared to Abraham. That's the first use of this word, to appear. We don't exactly know what it means when the Bible and biblical Hebrew uses this word for to appear. All I can tell you, it's the verb that means to see, and it's in the passive. So if you were getting super literal, you would translate this, and Yahweh was seen by Abraham. But is anybody really seeing God in these stories? Or is that just, the etymological background of the word to appear? This term is called the etymological fallacy. Now, distinguish between etiology, we had last time, the story of origins, and etymology, which is origins of words. And it's called the etymological fallacy, where people derive the meaning of a word from its root. That's wrong. Words don't always mean the same thing that their root means. And in fact, roots don't exist. They're an imaginary thing we made up in our minds in our understanding of languages. We derive them from words. So you have to, be very careful about that. So if there's a word read and a word misread and a word reading and a word reader and everything else you can have, it's not that there's a root, R-E-A-D, and all these other words derived from it. There was never a committee meeting of the first generation of English speakers who said, okay, let's take this root. What are we going to do with that? And then they made other words. So roots derive from words, not the other way around, and people really get that confused. Because whenever you learn a new language, you learn a new word, your teacher's very likely to try to connect it to some word you learned already and say, see, it has the same root as this word, so it means wrong. All right, so that's about the word to appear. All we know is it means that there's something that Abraham gets that did not necessarily happen, or at least the word wasn't used, with Adam or with Noah. A second, at the beginning of Genesis 15, it says, the word of Yahweh came to Abraham in a vision. We will have a lot about visions and dreams later, and appearances by God in visions and dreams. In theology classes, they would get into that. Like, it's an old classic theological question. Is there a difference if you have an experience of God in a dream or a vision, or if you had an experience of God like, empirical, 5 senses, you see and smell and hear and taste and touch God? And I'm told that most theologians would say there's no real difference between the two. A visionary or dream experience of God is as valid as a, out here, vision of God. I don't believe that for a second. I don't know, if I had a dream, and in the dream God speaks to me, and I know it's God because he's got a low resonant voice, and he tells me to do something, I might wake up and, it's a really vivid dream, and I would feel, oh my God, God spoke to me. That'd be pretty darn good. But it would not be as good as if that door to this room opened right now, and the Lord walked in and said, sit down, Friedman, I can take it from here. You all know which would impress you more, and I know which would impress me more. So I make that distinction, and the text gives both. The first one just says God appeared to Abraham. In the second one, it says the word of God came to Abraham in a vision, and I take those as descriptions of different kinds of divine experiences that Abraham has. No. So, he'd be more all-knowing, but less funny. So, and I use the word he in the biblical sense of God. I make no judgments about whether God exists now or is male or any of that. Now, the story goes on in Genesis 18 and 19, where Abraham now has moved to this new land. The land is called Canaan. It's the region that is today Israel. And it says in Genesis 18, Abraham has this visit from 3 visitors. And he's sitting at the entrance of his tent. And if you look at the text very carefully and try to figure out who the 3 visitors are, the opening of Genesis 18 is, and Yahweh appeared to him at the oaks of Mamre. So we're told explicitly in the first half of the first verse, this is going to be a story of an appearance of God. And he was sitting at the entrance of the tent in the heat of the day, and he lifted his eyes, and he saw, and here were 3 people standing over him. So it would appear to be that God appears in the form of 3 people. Or is it? The argument has been made that the 3 visitors are God and 2 angels. Why is that? The word angel does not occur anywhere in this chapter. But he's talking to the 3, When he sees the three, it says he gets up and he bows to the ground. And the word for bowing there is not the word that means, polite from the waist bowing. It's a Hebrew word that means like Islamic bowing, where you're prostrate. At my age especially, you want to get that word right. Prostrate, nose to the ground, which is interesting. And he says to them, Adonai, Lord, in the singular. So who's he talking to? To whom is he talking? And then there's this back and forth conversation where it gets very confusing with when it says, and God said, and when it's one of the three said. And then it says in verse 22, and the people turned from there and they went to Sodom, the city of Sodom that is nearby. But Abraham was still standing before Yahweh, which makes it sound like it's wrong to say that it's God and two angels, because it says the people went to Sodom, but Abraham is still standing there in front of Yahweh. But look at the first verse of the next chapter. Genesis 19, the first verse is, and the two angels came to Sodom. Where'd the third one go? So it was suggested that the third one is God, and Abraham's still in front of him. The other two are angels who go down to Sodom. When I first heard this in the 1960s, it was from a brilliant scholar, and I was persuaded by it. In my first several years of teaching in university, I taught it that way. He was wrong, I was wrong. Now all my students in my first couple of years out have it wrong. So if you ever meet anybody, and say, oh, I had that guy in California in 1976. Would you please say the thing about the three angels? It's not God and two angels. What I found was, many years later, I studied all occurrences of angels in the Hebrew Bible. It's wonderful to be paid for what I do, I look at all the occurrences of angel, and there are other passages. You'll see it, for example, in the scene coming where Hagar is addressed in the wilderness by an angel. And you'll see it goes back and forth between whether she's talking to an angel or talking to God. And we'll see it even more when we come to the story of Jacob wrestling with somebody in a certain story that could be an angel or could be God. And there are many stories where it goes back and forth between whether it's God or an angel talking. And it can be one angel, two angels, or three angels, or multiple angels. So it seems to me that the only explanation of this that fits all the cases of angels in the Bible is, what is an angel? It is not an independent being. They don't have wings and halos and beatific smiles and golden hair. They don't shoot arrows and you fall in love. Angels are expressions of God. That God is said in the Bible to be beyond human experience. When we come to the book of Kings, when King Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, he gives this dedication speech on the first day of the temple in 1 Kings 8. And he says, what's the point, God, of my building a house for you when the whole heavens and earth can't contain you? He says, so I hope that just your name will live in this house, will reside in this house. And so whenever we want to pray to you, we can pray facing this house and say your name, and your name will be like a concrete expression of you, which is why to this day, Jews all over the world pray facing the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. If you live in Israel, you aim towards the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. If you live in Georgia, synagogues are all supposed to be built so that you're facing east when you're praying in the synagogue, so you're looking there. If you're in a synagogue in China or India, they're built so that you're facing west when you pray. So that they're really stuck with that. So the idea is that God can't be contained in all the heavens and the earth. So what God does is do various mechanisms to be available to humans. And one of them is, it's like a shot of God that goes out. And when one of these emanations is in your face, it looks to you like a human, people. And that's what an angel is. It's like, I am sadly going to be at a wedding on Saturday when Georgia is playing its first football game. I will somehow get to a television. I will see and hear that game. I won't be at the game. But if someone would come up to me and say, afterwards and say, what are you doing? And I say, I saw Georgia play Clemson. Now that's the truth and it's false. That person might say, oh, get out of here. You were here the whole time. You were in Atlanta. You did not see Georgia play Clemson. Now, they'd be an idiot for saying that. True, you caught me. You caught me. I only saw it on television. I was not in a stadium watching a game. But in a certain sense, I did see the game. And in a certain sense, really all I saw was lights and sound that emanated from it. That's an angel. At Georgia, you can only use football as an analogy to convey what angels are. And, but that's what's going on. I used to use an orchestra, and you hear the music on television. It's better to use football. And so an angel is this experience of God. Now, I'm not stupid. I have heard that there's this religion called Christianity, which has this thing called the Trinity. And I understand that a religious Christian can hardly look at this text and see an appearance of God, and there's three people standing there, and that would sound like a prefiguring of what would happen in Christian doctrine. But all I can tell you is, in the terms of the text itself, if you didn't know about Christianity, you would certainly never imagine that the three are three different incarnations of God. And indeed, you see, in the next chapter there's two. In other chapters there will only be one. In one chapter there's many of them going up and down a staircase to heaven. That's in the Led Zeppelin version. And the result is that an angel biblically apparently, I mean, this is one case that's three, but you can't pick out the one that's three when there's others that are two or one or many and say, ha-ha, Christianity. Even though, I understand the attraction of that. All right. God makes a covenant with Abraham. So this is our second major covenant. The first covenant we saw last time was God and Noah, the Noahic covenant, right? And the promise of the covenant was security of the world. It won't, be taken apart at the seams again. The sign of the covenant was the rainbow. And God's mode of self-revelation in that covenant was only referring to himself as God, Hebrew Elohim, never by name. If you look, that's Genesis 9. The name Yahweh does not occur there. Now we have the second of the four major covenants of the Bible between God and Abraham, so it's called the Abrahamic covenant. And the promise is that he'll be the father of many nations, that this God will be his God, that kings will be descended from him. It has several promises. You can look at them. The sign of the covenant is circumcision, which he says should be when you're 8 days old, which accounts for the joke I told last time. And in this one, if you look in Genesis 17, in the first verse, God does not reveal his name there to Abraham. He calls himself El Shaddai. El means God. It is a word that can either be the name of God, like the chief god among the Canaanites is called El, and God in the Bible sometimes is called by name El, so it's like an additional name to Yahweh. Or El is also the generic word for God. So it can both mean God, any God is an El, or it can mean El specifically, the chief god of the region of Canaan. Shaddai is a term people have argued about forever. So if you look at the beginning of Genesis 17, most English Bibles since the King James translate it as God Almighty, even though Shaddai does not mean Almighty. In Akkadian, it refers to mountains. And in Akkadian, there's a passage where the gods are referred to as the Shadu Rabu. Shadu, mountains, Rabu, like the word rabbi, which derives, from Semitic Hebrew as well. So it means people tell you the word rabbi means teacher. Everybody says that. I don't know who started that, but rabbi does not mean teacher. Rabbi means great person, someone great. And so Shadu Rabu would mean the great mountains, and it's a euphemism for the gods. And in 1976, there was discovered a text in Moabite. Moab was the country east of Israel. It's what is today Jordan, the middle part of Jordan. And in this text, there is a reference to the gods. And the gods there are referred to as the Shaddayim. The council of the gods are the Shaddayim. Now, whether that means mountains or something else, we have then more than one text where it's the term for the gods, which would mean that El Shaddai means El of the council of all the gods. Does that mean that the author of Genesis 17 believed that there were many gods? Is it rather that by then he understood it the way people do now, like God Almighty or something, but that originally it referred to El in a council of gods when people still believed in a lot of gods? Lecture 24. In the story there, you should take note, God predicts to Abraham that he's going to have a son. He should name him Isaac, who will be his successor. And Abraham is an old man at this point, and his wife is an old woman, is not believing in any miraculous births. So he says, "Oh God, let Ishmael live before you." So remember in the story, it was that Sarah is getting older, and she and Abraham have not been able to conceive. And so they do this surrogacy where her maid, Hagar, who's an Egyptian maid working for them, is made a surrogate for Sarah, a concubine to Abraham. Abraham has sex with Hagar, and they have the son Ishmael. And then it's only later that there's going to be this possibly miraculous thing where Sarah, when she's 90 years old, gives birth to Isaac. 90. That's a real woman. And Abraham was a real man. When men were men, and anyway, stop me, somebody stop me. So you have to understand that Ishmael technically is the son of Abraham and Sarah, legally. Obviously, biologically, he's the son of Hagar. But legally, Hagar is a surrogate, and Ishmael is a son, not adopted, just their son, the same as nowadays couples sometimes have a surrogate, and then the child they have is filled out on the documents to be their son. And so Abraham says, I'll go with it. No miracles, thank you, God. I'll go with Ishmael. And God says, no, his descendants will become a great people too, but I'm telling you, for you, this covenant goes through Isaac. People sometimes confuse this and understand Ishmael to be the ancestor of all Arabs. Some people even confuse it and understand Ishmael to be the ancestor of all Muslims. That's just not correct. By biblical, by Islamic standard, all Muslims don't have a common ancestor. The most populous Muslim country is Indonesia. Indonesians do not, as far as I know, think that they have a common ancestor with Jews and Arabs. There is a tradition among Arabs, not among Muslims. People confuse those two, right? They're Christian Arabs. There's all kinds of Arabs. There's a tradition among Arabs that they are all descended from Ishmael. But that's not the way it's presented in the text. Ishmael, in the biblical text, is the ancestor of the Ishmaelites. Is that too hard for anybody? And that's not to attack anybody's modern belief and all. Things change. Jews have different doctrines about where they came from and all now too. But understand from the biblical point of view, Ishmael is the ancestor of the Ishmaelites. Isaac is the ancestor of, we'll wait and see. Then there's the story of Sarah and Hagar, which is this dynamic that would never really happen in real life, a polygamous society where a man can have multiple women in his house. He's got a wife and a concubine, and they have conflict between them. I'm sure this would never happen in real life. In fact, I once studied in Jerusalem with a rabbi who had a housekeeper. She was a Jewish woman, but she had come to Israel from a Muslim country. So in Israel, polygamy is illegal. You have to have one wife in Israel. But in Muslim countries, you can have more than one wife. So the Jews who come from Muslim countries sometimes arrive in Israel, guys with more than one wife. So this woman who worked as a housekeeper in this rabbi's house, it turns out she's from one of those countries, or Yemen or Morocco, and she mentions that her husband has a concubine living in the house with them. And this rabbi, he was a British rabbi who moved to Israel, so he was very English, and the English understand that the way the English do things is the correct way. And he says, how can you put up with that? And she said, well, if I'd make a fuss about it, he'd throw me out. And besides, I'm a wife. She's just a concubine. Now, that's a world that most of us in the U.S., don't confront. But that's what's going on in this biblical account. And then towards the end, it says that Abraham takes yet another woman. Now, in Hebrew, like in French, the word for woman is the same as the word for wife. So it's not clear if this other woman is another concubine or if she is a wife. It's after Sarah has died. And she is Keturah. And though she's a fairly minor player in the Bible, I like to make a big deal of Keturah because, darn it, if you list like the 10 most underappreciated, forgotten people in the Bible, I'm guessing that 8 of the 10 are female, first of all. And Keturah especially, after all, she's a wife to Abraham, or concubine, and she gives birth to 6 sons for him. One of them is Midian, and the Midianites are going to matter a lot later in the story. That is the descendants of Keturah and Abraham. This is a great one. Try this on Bible scholars. Try this on rabbis, on priests, ministers, anybody you really want to embarrass. Go to them and say, who are the ancestors of the Midianites? Midianites are descended from a guy named Midian. Who's Midian's father? And they never know it. And you go, Abraham. Isn't that nice? If you don't think it's nice, fine. My sister was a Sunday school teacher, and she was teaching them about Abraham, and the kids had just been learning American history in public school. So they kept confusing Abraham with Abraham Lincoln. And when she'd have them draw pictures of Abraham, they got Daniel Day-Lewis, right? So she said to them, it has one name. It's not Abraham Lincoln. He has just one name. Now, what's his one name? And the kids all said, Lincoln. And that's why I only teach adults who never get anything wrong, So. Now, Abraham has one famous scene in the middle of this that I've left out, and it's important. He argues with God about what's going to happen down in the city of Sodom. And it's a famous passage where near the end of Genesis 18, when apparently the 2 angels have left, and it's just this one who is both God and an angel, this one who's left, and tells Abraham, the cry of Sodom is really tremendous. And Abraham, now remember, he has feelings about Sodom. His nephew, Lot, lives in Sodom. So he's going to try to argue for Sodom, and you can't really know what his motive is. Is it that he's just worried about his nephew, Lot, whom he never mentions? Or is it that he's a decent man who cares about the fate of people, even if they're, not the nicest people on the earth? So he uses this famous line to God, would you kill everybody just for the sake of the bad ones? He says, will the judge of all the earth not do justly? So he's debating with God. And I'm betting that most of you imagine that if you got the door opening thing and you really got to talk with God, and it's really God, resonant voice, it's God. And God says to you, I want you to do such and such. You wouldn't say, well, do you really think that's a good idea? Most people don't imagine themselves doing that. So here's this case of this man who's as close to God as anybody's gotten. And he makes arguments. And it's also an argument that raises questions like, is anything higher than God? If you say, well, can the judge of all the earth not do justice? Well, does that mean that justice is higher than God, and even God can't behave unjustly? Or could you say, no. Since God is the inventor of justice, Abraham's argument would just mean you can't be inconsistent with yourself. And is consistency higher than God? So it raises, once you start asking theological questions, you go down the road to Professor Power's class, and you're there for semesters with questions like this. But in any event, they have this argument, and it's a very interesting argument. Now, in the Bible, there isn't a lot of dialogue. So when there is dialogue, like between God and Adam and Eve, you stop and focus in very carefully on the wording. So Abraham's first position is, well, what if there's 50 righteous people in the city? God says, okay, I'll save the city for the 50. Now, Abraham's second position is going to be 45. But if you look at the text, he doesn't say, what if there are 45? He says, what if we're short the 50 by 5? See, that sounds better. That's like, it's not $4, it's $3.99, He's fully, to which God responds, I won't do it for 45. He doesn't buy it. It's like he's saying to Abraham, look, do you want to do business here or do you want to play games with me? I'm God, I'm all powerful, all knowing. Cut the crap and let's do, well, God might not say cut. He might, he invented that word too. Stop this. And then Abraham's next positions are 40, 30, 20, 10. He just goes straight after that when he learned that, word games are not going to work on an omniscient being. And he gets God down to 10. But, there's that line, in every bet there's two people, a cheater and a sucker. And in this one, Abraham is not the cheater. And he gets God down to 10, but there aren't 10. And it turns out there's maybe one, Lot, his nephew. But it's not even clear if Lot is such a good guy or if it's that Lot gets out because of the merit of Abraham, his uncle. So then when they come to destroy the city, it'll only be Lot and his two virgin daughters who get out. He has married daughters, but they and their husbands say, you're crazy. Nothing's going to happen to this city. We're staying. So they stay. And he leaves with his two daughters. And you have to note what happens in that story. Lot has two daughters. And remember, they've left Sodom, they and their mother. They're not even supposed to look back. The wife looks back and turns into salt. Some people say that's the origin, the etiology of the Dead Sea in Israel, which, if you know, it's so thick with salt and minerals that you can actually lie in it on your back and you don't sink. And all the tourists who go to Israel do this thing. You lie down in the Dead Sea with a book or a newspaper and you just lie back and hold it and your friends take a picture of you. So someday, I hope you'll all go someday and get the picture taken there. And it's true, there are deposits of salt all around the Dead Sea. But that's almost all recent history that it became quite like that. And there's no reason to think that Sodom was located right there by the Dead Sea or that this is the origin of that. But there's a lot of salt there, so some people point at a particular pillar of, every tourist guide in Israel will point at a particular pillar of salt and say, yeah, that's the former Mrs. Lot. But now he and the daughters escape to the mountains. So now remember, there's only Lot and his two virgin daughters. And as far as they know, the whole world is destroyed outside of where they are. They don't know that it's only a city or two. And so they, in their minds, right, they have to repopulate the earth. So they each, on 2 successive nights, right, they each get the father drunk and have sex with their father and become pregnant and give birth to a son. This is one fertile family. I know families that have tried for years to get pregnant. These, on the first go, each one of them gets pregnant with, of course, a boy. And one of the boys who is born this way is named Moab. And the other one's name is Ben-Ami, which looks like nothing so much as Ammon. Moab and Ammon were the 2 countries east of Israel across the Jordan River. So what does a story like this tells you? It means that the Israelites understood Moabites and Ammonites to be kin to them. They're related. And indeed, if you look at something written in Moabite, you couldn't even tell that it's not Hebrew. I mean, it's that similar. So they understood they're related to Moabites and Ammonites, but on the other hand, Moabites and Ammonites are tainted because they're all descended from incest. So it's an important story. And the Moabites and Ammonites will come up again later in the story. So understand, when you see Midianites, Moabites, Ammonites, Ishmaelites coming up in the story, you have to know that they all came out of this. And when you read this, you had to know that it all came out of Noah. And when you read Noah, you had to know that it all came out of creation in the Garden of Eden. So it's still this layers of background that Auerbach was so brilliant in pointing out after the book had been around for 2,000 years, and he points it out. And that leads us to maybe the most famous story of Abraham, the story of the binding of Isaac. Some people call the story the sacrifice of Isaac, but since he doesn't, in fact, get sacrificed in the end, he gets bound and placed on the altar, some people more often call it the binding of Isaac. In Hebrew, it's always referred to as Akedat Yitzchak, which means the binding of Isaac, not the sacrifice of Isaac. God says to Abraham this famous wording, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and sacrifice him on one of the mountains that I'll show you. And the next verse is, and Abraham got up early in the morning. He's quick to do whatever God tells him. Now, when people talk about Abraham in later Jewish and Christian tradition, they usually speak of Abraham as the model of faith, as the first monotheist, the great believer. But I don't think that that is the conclusion you'd get if you just read straight through the texts. There's only one time where it says that God said something and Abraham trusted him, which sounds faithful. But the most common characteristic of Abraham is obedience. Abraham is the man of obedience. You can tell Abraham, leave your land, sacrifice the kid. Sacrifice a kid instead of the kid. See, the pun doesn't work in Hebrew there. It's better in English. Leave your land. Do anything. Jump. Yes, sir. How high, sir? Can I come down yet, sir? Abraham is a Marine. I mean, he is absolutely a Marine for God. He is a person who will obey anything. And that's what God's been looking for. Just a few obedient men. Now, it won't last, just as Noah was a righteous man, and that didn't mean that the generations after him all turned righteous. So Abraham's an obedient man. All the descendants after him won't be obedient. They'll be famous for their disobedience for most of the Bible. But at least understand what it is, because the text never says why God chooses Abraham. At the beginning of Genesis 12, it simply says, and God appeared to Abraham. And God said. And until then, you don't know. Now, there's all kinds of midrash about this. One of the most famous midrashim is how Abraham arrived at faith in God. And the story is that his father, Terach, was an idol maker for a living. So he grew up around the idol shop, and he watched his father making these statues, and then everybody bowing down to the statues and treating them like gods. So in this midrash, they're still treating pagan religion as if it's idol worship. And Abraham watches all this, and he doesn't buy it. And so the way he comes to the idea of one God is he says, well, let me see, maybe the sun is God. But then he sees, at night the sun goes away and the moon replaces it. And he goes, oh, no, the moon must be God. No, then the sun comes and replaces it. Well, no, then it must be something else. So it's the sky that holds all. No, then all the clouds come and you can't see the sky. So he goes through all the elements of nature and concludes that there must be only one God who's something way behind all of that. So in this midrash, what Abraham does is he goes into his father's house and he's just fed up with all this idol worship. So he takes a stick and he smashes all the idols in his father's house. And then he realizes, well, now he's in trouble. So he takes the stick and he puts it in the hand of one of the idols that he didn't break. See? And his father comes in and says, what happened here? And Abraham says, that God there, he did it. He broke all the other gods. And his father says, get out of here. Those are just statues that I made. And Abraham goes, ha ha. And that's the midrash on that. But none of that is in the Bible. There is no story in the Bible about why it is that God chooses this particular man for the covenant. And if you look at the stories, it seems to me it is, here is a man who will finally do what I say. But I admit, I'm deriving that. It never says it in so many words in the story. Now, here's a question you could ask. When God told Abraham about what was going to happen in Sodom, Abraham has this actual argument with God. It's one of the great scenes of the Bible where a man is debating something with God. Now God says, sacrifice your own son. And Abraham says, yes, sir, and he gets up early in the morning. And you go, why is it that he's willing to do more for these not particularly great people in Sodom, but he won't do as much for his own son? Now, the text never answers that question. I'm putting that question to you. It seems to me there are multiple answers. The first is because Abraham is an obedient man. When God tells Abraham about Sodom, he never tells Abraham to do anything. Abraham doesn't have to do the massacre of Sodom. God is going to do that himself. So Abraham is open to argue because he's obedient. He does what he's told. But he wasn't told to do anything in the Sodom case. But in the case of Isaac, God said, do it. He's got to do it. Answer number two, Abraham has a personal interest in the Isaac case. And as in a court of law, when you have a personal interest, you don't, participate on the jury, let alone with the judge. So because he's being commanded to do his own son, he has no standing to argue, whereas in the case of Sodom, even though he had a nephew in the town, he was arguing for, any of the people of Sodom. Or I'll give you choice three, which is Abraham had tried it in Sodom in Genesis 19, arguing with God, and it didn't work. It didn't change anything. So 3 chapters later in Genesis 22, he's learned this doesn't really work, this arguing with God business. God knows what's going to happen. So he just doesn't argue. Take your pick. I like all three answers. Now, I should comment at least on the homosexuality aspect. And that is that there is no homosexuality aspect in this story. In the story of what happens in Sodom, people say that the two angels come to town, and they're in the house of this man Lot, Abraham's nephew, and the people of Sodom surround the house and say, send them out that we may know them. And there is this famous thing on people joke saying, oh, did you know those so-and-so in the biblical sense? I mean, it is true that there are passages in the Bible where the word to know means to know intimately, and it's a euphemism for sex. And so it's been understood that the people of the town want sex with the two visitors. Now here's the problem. The 3 people who come to Abraham and then the 2 who come to Sodom are called people. In Hebrew, as in some other languages that some of you may know, the word for people and the word for male people, men, are the same word. So you can't know whether to translate that 3 men appeared to Abraham and 2 men were there in Lot's house in Sodom, or if it means 3 people and 2 people were in Sodom. If it's people, then it can be a mixed group of men and women. What it can't be that all 3 are female or all 2 who come to Sodom. The 2 in Sodom can be either 2 men or a man and a woman. So when the people surround the house and say, send these men out, That's in English Bible translations of that. But there is nothing in the text to make you think that it's guys only in the house. And you notice it says all the people of Sodom, from the youngest to the oldest, surrounded the house. So again, the English Bibles often make it all the men of Sodom, but it does not say that. It means everybody in town. That's why the town can be destroyed, because everybody is culpable in this event. So it's presumably rape. It sure sounds like they mean to rape the two guests in the house. And it's forcible sex, which is always forbidden in the Bible and always punishable by death. But there's no reason to think that it's guys having sex with guys. But it's so much been understood as a homosexuality story that, in English, the word sodomy is a word for anal sex, which can be with a woman, but it was understood, initially to be a term of homosexuality. And I'm not making an argument for or against homosexuality here. I do have a definite opinion on that subject, which is not my business to shove down your throats. I'm just telling you that you can't derive it automatically from this story. And don't worry, we will get to the text later, if some of you know of, when we get to King David and his friend Jonathan, which people use as a text that's permissive of homosexuality, and I'll throw that one out too. So I will evenly attack all arguments for and against this from the text. All right, so now we come to the life of Isaac. Now I've established already there are going to be these three major men. They're called patriarchs, the three fathers. We'll put them here in the ziggurat. The three fathers, ancestors of the whole nation of Israel and some other nations later in the story. And they are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are, as you saw, a fair number of stories about Abraham. Some of them are famous, some less. They involve more than one wife. They involve all kinds of events. And when we come to his grandson, Jacob, you'll see likewise lots of stories. Jacob and the relationship between him and his 12 sons, especially his son Joseph, take up the last 15 chapters of Genesis. But here's Isaac in the middle. And he must have had middle patriarch syndrome or something, because there's much less about Isaac than there is about Abraham and Jacob. His whole life is different from the lives of his father and his son. First of all, there's just plain fewer stories about Isaac. Second, he's a passive figure. In the two most famous stories about him, one of them, he's on an altar and his father's going to sacrifice him. And the other one, he's on his deathbed and his son Jacob is tricking him. So in the two most famous stories about Isaac, he's a passive player and either his father or his son is the active player. There's a story where it says when he's going to meet his wife Rebekah, who is chosen for him, he at the time is out in a field meditating. Now, whatever they thought that meant and what his mantra was and in what language it was, I don't know. But he's the only person in the text ever described that way. Notably, he never leaves the land of the covenant. He stays in Canaan/Israel his whole life. Abraham had been to the two other major centers of the ancient Near East. He had come from Ur, that's in Mesopotamia, and in one story he and Sarah go down to Egypt and get in trouble with the Pharaoh. Their son Jacob lives part of his life going back to Aram, which is what is today Syria, and part of his life going down, he ends up with his sons in Egypt. That is, they both visit the other two, the real two great centers of civilization of the time, and Isaac doesn't. And it's not just a chance little point I'm noting in the text. It's explicit. It says there was a famine in the days of Isaac, and he said to God, should I go down to Egypt to get food? And Abraham says, no, and God says to him, no, don't do that. Whereas Abraham had done just that when there was famine. He went down to Egypt to get food, and Jacob the same. And when he wants to get married, his father Abraham says, I'll send my servant back to Aram, where I came from, what is today Syria, and bring back a wife, because he wants a wife sort of from his own kin and background for his son Isaac. And the servant says, well, what if the woman won't come? Can I take Isaac and bring him there to meet her? And Abraham says, no. If the woman won't come, the deal's off. She has to come here. He does not move there. So it's explicit that Isaac doesn't go to Egypt or to Mesopotamia when his father and his son did. Isaac never fights. Abraham, if you look in Genesis 14, gets involved in a war and helps one side win. Jacob fights and struggles his whole life. Isaac, no. Isaac is the only one who has only one wife. He has Rebekah. His father has Abraham and Sarah and Keturah. His father Abraham has Sarah and Hagar and Keturah. I got it right the second time. And his son, Isaac's son Jacob, has Leah and Rachel as his wives, and Bilhah and Zilpah as his two concubines. But Isaac has only Rebekah. Isaac is the only one who doesn't have his name changed. His name is decided before he's born. His mother, Sarah, laughs when she hears this message from God that she's going to have a son when she's an old woman. And she says explicitly she's past menopause. She says, I don't have the way of women anymore. Despite that, she has the son, so God says, name him Laughter. And the name Isaac, Yitzchak in Hebrew, means he laughs. But that's the name he's born with, and that's the name he dies with. Whereas Abraham, it says originally his name was Abram, and God changes it to Abraham. And the son's name will be Jacob, and God changes it to Israel, which we'll come to later. Also, Isaac, if you look at the years, who begat whom and how long they lived and all that stuff, which I know fascinated all of you. But if you look at that, you see Isaac lives the longest of the three of them. That's a big thing with men, if you don't know. Men, the age at which our father dies, almost all men will tell you that's like a number in front of our eyes. And until you reach that number, you don't feel quite safe. And so he lives the longest. So what should we make of all this? That Isaac is so different from his father and his son. Again, this isn't something that is just told in the story. So all you can do is speculate. Or if you want to make a hypothesis. See, hypothesis, you know what it means in Greek? To guess, right? But I hypothesize, I don't guess. It seems to me the thing that's different about Isaac is he once lay on an altar to be a sacrifice to God. His life is dedicated. His life is sacred. And whether the sacrifice came off in the end or not, the fact is his whole life is changed after that. Now, I cannot prove that that event in the Isaac story is the reason for all these other qualities of the Isaac story. All I know is it fits together with them. You can just, instead of calling that the reason for the others, just call it yet one more way that he's different. Nobody tried to sacrifice Abraham or Jacob. So that he lives this extraordinary life. It's his own life. If you want to take away, messages, if you're ever like a minister or a rabbi and you're making a sermon, you can say, you see, each of you is your own person. You don't have to make your parents' mistakes. You don't have to make your children's mistakes. You're not responsible for them. You're not responsible. You're yourself. You could fly with this. But whether you want to take it in your modern messages or not, at least understand the text as it stands, which is there are these three important men, and the three are each utterly different. See you next time.